Well, my mandate, if you will, today was really to address this issue from a producer perspective, and where do we go with that? What is it that we need to tell producers about animal ID and or traceability and the system in of itself? And so I think there's three basic questions. Where are we? Where some might have us go, and then what I believe, where do we need to go, and what is it that really is meaningful as we talk about this very complicated issue? Well, this is 3 years ago. Some of you might remember being here, and we had the secretary here, and we had the grannies with guns outside, and we had additional security, and so that was then, and probably not a lot has changed, but we'll talk about at the end. I do think it has changed somewhat. That was 2006. 2009 sort of brought us these listening sessions. All of a sudden, we've decided that we're going to go out and listen for whatever reason. And with all due respect to our federal representatives in here, that's no poke at you individually. And it is a little bit like, okay, we've been wandering through the desert, now all of a sudden let's ask for directions. And so, that's where we've been this summer, and it certainly was revealing. And I thought Chuck Jolly did a great job. That was then, this is now, and this is sort of the fair assessment. Small handful of people stood up at about this national program during this tour, and the vast majority of a very enthusiastic crowd spoke out against NAIS, and I don't think that's news to any of us, and certainly that sentiment was voiced here yesterday afternoon very clearly. And what I think is very important about the listening sessions isn't what was communicated, it's who was coalesced and who was emboldened by those, and certainly the opposition was. And I'm not here either to endorse or to negate NAIS, but I think it's important that we recognize that this is the environment in with which we are dealing and where we go relative to NAIS, okay? And certainly salty language and all of that, and the grannies with guns and the NRA and that type of thing. So, NAIS, 2 years ago when I spoke here, I used this wonderful line from the movie The Princess Bride. Those of you who know the movie, it's one of my favorites. I have my 5-year-old daughter here. I've probably watched it 200 times now in my lifetime. And I'm a little weird. I like it. So NAIS, is it dead? Or from the Princess Bride, is it just mostly dead, which means it's slightly alive? And, that's the question, okay? Who knows what happens inside the Beltway? There's $7.3 million worth of funding left in the Senate, and there's none in the House, and where we end up is another question. But I think it's important that we remember that there's also 2 other bills sitting out there, one in the Senate, 425, Food Safety and Tracking Improvement Act, and then over on the House side is the Food Safety Enhancement Act. Both of those have some traceability provisions in them. And it will be very interesting to see what occurs after we come back from recess. I don't think we need to be reminded of what's happening out there in the country, and this Congress may decide that this may be an important issue to them all of a sudden to actually get something done politically and maybe have a success, what have you. I mean, it's very hard to assess, but it certainly hasn't gone completely off the radar, and we need to be reminded of that. I think then we need to provide some perspective as we talk about NAIS and a national mandate. I think there's the need for some real perspective about those who are opposed, and namely one particular organization. Because I think it's one thing certainly to say, you know what, I'm against NAIS and I oppose it because of a fundamental principle. I don't want government in my life. I think that's great. But when we begin to have some arguments that maybe are somewhat disingenuous or maybe not totally factual, I think that becomes very concerning. And so let's look at those, okay? I just finished an article for CAF News. It's out this month relative to this very issue. And these are some of the quotes that I used in my article relative to what our CAF is talking about NAIS. And this is their perspective, and that's fair enough. It's a culmination of 10 years of aggressive efforts. Boy, I'd have trouble with that. I don't know how aggressive it's been. It's been going on for 10 years. I mean, that's not very aggressive to me. But to destroy the very foundations of U.S. livestock. Well, okay, whatever. That's a little draconian, and it's fundamentally flawed, rotten at its core. It's un-American. Fine. Okay, it's Staten Weldon. He's a Region 5 director. He says it's a veiled governmental marketing program designed to economically disadvantage independent U.S. cattle producers by reducing what little competition remains in the highly concentrated and quickly shrinking U.S. cattle industry. Okay, I give that to you so you have some perspective of where they're coming from. Well, our CAF then decided to do this 12-day blitz. Many of you have seen this. I want to pick on a couple of those, and this is the one that really caught my eye. The cost of NAIS will worsen the ongoing long-run lack of profitability for independent cattle producers. Okay, and those of you that have read this know that they used this USDA number, $493.87. That's what cattle producers have lost per head over this 12-year period, 96 through 2007. Okay, and I will tell you that is indeed an accurate number, and that is indeed what USDA claims the loss is. Now, what's the other side of the story of that? What's the land value done? Okay, part of that $493.87 includes the land costs. What have your land values done? Okay, I just went through a little bit of math by USDA's very own numbers. The average U.S. farm size in America is 418 acres, and by the way, most of those are diversified, right? Very few are cow-calf operations the sole source of income on a farm. But and it's very hard. How many acres to a cow nationally? It ranges from 200 to 5 or 2, even in my part of the country. You can run a cow on 2 acres through the year. But let's just assume kind of 10 acres per year at $500 a cow, you're running 42 cows at $500. You've lost $21,000 annually. You do that over a 12-year lifespan, you've lost $252,000 or $250,000. Okay. Well, interestingly enough, pasture value in that same time frame has increased $600 per acre, and the math works out, $252,000. And that's the very nature of a commodity business. It's break even. And most of us recognize that many producers probably don't make money off their cows. It's a land investment. It's a way to take that in, okay? But regardless of what numbers you put here, that's the other side of the story. Now, my friend Wes Ishmael right here just ran a wonderful article. I believe you entitled it "Put Up or Shut Up." Is that right, Wes? Okay. And talking about the cost of the system, all right? And, it's whatever it's going to be, $2 to $6. When we're talking about, if you're going to tout the $500 loss, $4 or $5 is really not that significant more. I mean, let's put that into context. And finally, on the other side of that, LMIC, who happens to be associated with USDA, and their average cow-calf return they project at has been positive $40 per head over the last 12 years. Okay? So my point being is that we need to take all of that and put it into some context and make sure that we're telling the entire story before we just begin to kind of throw out various types of issues. Now, I think the other thing that's important, and we are always very careful to not tie NAIS and country of origin labeling in there together, and I understand that. They're two very different types of programs, but several years ago, I wrote an article, and it ended up in Feedstuffs, Rod, and about country of origin labeling, and I talked about that it would be evaluated in several different ways. And I've followed up on that issue most recently in Ag Site relative to country of origin labeling. And the rationalization is that it's a right-to-know issue. It's food safety, and we're going to create some differential demand curves for U.S. producers versus Canadian and or Mexican producers or cattle or hogs or whatever have you, okay? The reality in all of that is that all of them go through the same grading system, and there is no evidence that imported food is less safe. Okay? And, you know, the demand issue is one that you only can evaluate over the long run. So I think that's important, and I could go on and on about the opportunity costs and what we've spent relative to country of origin labeling. And I think we've spent a lot of time over there, and we've probably lost a lot of time here relative to real, meaningful traceability. But what troubles me as we begin to talk about some of the opposition is that on one hand, we're going to endorse country of origin labeling, we're going to fight for it, and we're going to say that USDA is the entity to implement this, and it's worthy of an industry-wide mandate. But then on the other hand, we have NAIS, where USDA is out to destroy the very foundation of the livestock industry. Now, those just don't compute. You can't do those things together. So that's a very disingenuous type of position. The other thing is the business implications, and this is where my interest really comes in. And Mr. Weldon made this wonderful argument in Ag Week in June 1st and began to talk about business relationships. And that's when I like that. I dig that stuff, okay? And talking about how individual producers have carved out markets to obtain extra value. And, you know, that's the essence of capitalism, is it not? Okay, and over time, these markets and feedlots earn reputations for sourcing, marketing, and feeding specific quality and type of cattle highly coveted by the concentrated meat packers. And his point being, obviously we know the argument, is that this information and these networks would be broken apart by NAIS. But he's endorsing, you know, business relationships. And this is a slide I used 2 years ago when I spoke here in 2007. You know, that's really what we're about. That's what the beef quality audit talked about, is that we want to move towards marketing networks and or what I call market-driven traceability, right? Okay, if you're going to source these and create these business relationships, then you're going to be involved in market-driven traceability. That's wonderful. That's great. And what we're doing ultimately is sort of moving from this very traditional, commodity-minded supply chain, adversarial relationships, win-lose, however you want to describe it, we're moving more towards a coordinated network. Okay, where we have open communications, we're responsive, we emphasize value, it's sustainable, what have you, and we recognize that everyone needs to benefit in order to stay involved. Those are business relationships. Okay? So I think it's very difficult, again, on one hand, to denigrate the NAIS influence upon the free market system, that somehow the packer is going to, you know, circumvent this system, and again, that goes back to Cool, and you're going to also then endorse these business relationships, but then on the other hand, you're going to endorse an entity like OCM, the Organization for Competitive Markets, who basically wants to handcuff those types of business relationships. So you can't win within this. So my point being is that I think, and I recognize some of you may endorse that, I think we need to be very careful in the type of information that's coming out in terms of these blitzes, because I'm not sure the information really is fair or credible, because I think there's arguments on the other side. Now, I have not seen, and a point was made yesterday, where are those arguments? Why aren't we touting those if we believe in market-driven traceability? And I'll talk a little bit more about this business relationship in a very applied manner in just a little bit later. I think the other thing, too, is we talk about NAIS and any entity, is that this emphasis on the packer, the evil packer, for me is very misplaced. And you know, Kevin works in this industry, and I don't. You know, the top 5 grocers, however you want to categorize, and it's what's included in there, okay, in terms of their other businesses. For example, Kroger has all of these other convenience stores and what have you. Walmart, whether you're going to lump Sam's in with them. But, you know, the top 4 grocers are basically in the same order, and then Costco and Ahold, and how you want to put all of those together. But ultimately, the point being is that these are the real channel leaders in the meat business, right? Not the packer, it's ultimately the retailer. Walmart wields a pretty big bat, right? In fact, we had a executive from Hershey down with us about 10 days ago. And we began to talk about the price of sugar. I'm one of those, I like to talk about every commodity there is. And he said, actually, a year ago, Hershey went to Walmart and said, we need to raise our price. They're not going to let you do it. You have to justify it. Okay? And I think it's interesting, as we talk a lot about Walmart, to me, the one that's very interesting is Kroger, because they're beginning to obtain multiple years of buying data. And they're beginning to kind of hold that, and in the aggregate, they've got some buying power because they recognize where their supply needs to be, at what time, the seasonal types of demands, okay? And they could begin to put all of those together in terms of some traceable attributes. And you know what? They've stayed away from trying to play with Walmart. They are in their own kind of model and being very distinctive. And so that's another player that we need to recognize could be a very serious channel leader. I think often we like to focus on Walmart. We need to look at the others also. So with all that, let's talk a little bit about consumers and how they perceive traceability and what's important here and where we need to go. And I had to include this. I don't know where I found this, right? You ought to go to the store and buy the meat that was made there. Okay, what does that mean? But that's the reality, right? So okay. I think the economy is extremely important. I just received an email yesterday talking about GDP and potential beef demand and where do I think we're headed. I do think there's one important outcome of this, is that obviously consumers are trading down or away from the restaurant. That's very clearly articulated. And what happens is, and I think Kevin did a wonderful job kind of explaining this, is that they're much more engaged probably in what they purchase. Okay? Because as a restaurant, they go and they buy the total package, where here they're buying individual items. And so they're spending a little bit more time in the grocery store. They're still time-starved, but they're spending more time and they're recognizing maybe a little bit more about what's going into their system and not taking trust for it. They're more engaged in all of that. And so the economy has had that impact. So we're demanding more of supermarkets and of the items that are included in there. Now, with that said, and not all of this is real feel-good, and there's some reality here. And our esteemed colleague sitting right up here, Rod Smith, published an article almost a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, and I just remember the title that caught me. Producers have an uphill march. Okay? Now remember, this is a year and a half ago. 50% of consumers say they're confident in the safety of their food versus automobiles, consumer electronics, clothing, pharmaceuticals, and then at that time, obviously, toys, China, and the whole melamine thing and lead thing was coming in. And so that's important, but look where we are, okay? And 65% possess confidence in bread, cereals, grain products, 48% beef, pork, poultry. That's an uphill march, okay? And they're trusting some activist organizations. What's interesting to me is then when you begin to ask consumers about what I would call forward documentation, and I see Kara in the back, and I've had lots of communication with John and Leanne about this whole term traceability. Maybe that's not the right term. And I like the term forward documentation, but that's probably not quite the right term. But how do we get consumers to buy into this? Traceability is always backwards. We want to create value going forward. But 57% are willing to pay more for milk or milk products without BST. Okay? They want some identity preservation, and they are willing, they say, to pay more for that. More concerned about food that we eat 5 years ago, 76%. Okay? Area of concern, fruits and vegetables, 53%, dairy, 53%, chicken, 67%, beef, 78%. Okay? They're concerned about it. Now, are they responding to that? Maybe not necessarily, but it's in the back of their mind, and that's really important. They need some information. They need some reassurance. What's really troubling to me, and this came out earlier this year or late last year, and I haven't seen it reappear anywhere. What concerns me is it's not just about the food, but how they perceive us as producers. Consumer opinions of ranchers and cattlemen. And you could say, you know what, that's pretty much a flat line, 67%, woohoo. But look where we've came from right after BSE, 87%. Why has that dropped off by 20% in the last 4 years? What have we done wrong? Where have we missed the boat? And again, I know that's not a feel-good, loving, wonderful message and everything's great out there, but I think that's very important to embrace. Okay? Yeah, it's better than half, but why the drop-off? That's concerning to me. What also is concerning to me is Google, and we talk a lot about Twitter and Facebook, and I just don't get Facebook, but I do get Twitter. It's Google. If you just did this search, okay, for beef recall, these are the first 2 hits that came up a couple of days ago. What concerns me is not necessarily the titles, but the pictures and this big recall. It's kind of ominous. You think the Andromeda strain, what have you. That's how powerful that tool is. And that's how we respond to those types of things. And that's what we're dealing with. And we need to be very, very careful in that, is trying to prevent that. Because those pictures and those titles coupled together, that first hit, boom, okay? That's it. That's where we are. And that's the reality for a lot of people who don't understand this. But I think the big issue here is really this past year in terms of peanut butter. And my question would be have we reached some kind of tipping point in terms of the need and or desire for traceability and the need to make consumers feel better about the types of products that they purchase. And this really struck home with me personally. My daughter, who's with me this week, goes to parochial school, and I am on the school board there. And we had a school council meeting last spring when all of this was happening, and all the peanut butter they had to get sent back. Okay? Well, my daughter eats peanut butter sandwiches just about every single day. And I saw this picture of this little boy, and I thought to myself, that could have been my daughter. She could have been eating that paste that goes on the sandwiches, and, it's just by chance or by luck, it didn't happen. Okay, so that hits home, and that strikes home pretty hard. And with all of that said, perception matters. Whether it's real or not, I think perception matters. And what's important here, what I heard Larry Pope say so clearly a year and a half ago in Washington, D.C. at the Outlook Forum is his company had nothing to do with Hallmark, but he said it didn't matter. Every incident causes consumers to trust us a little bit less. And we somehow needed to document and verify that we have nothing to do with that, but we have no system to do that because we're getting lumped together. And Hallmark, as Mike Siemens put it this past February in Phoenix, is a game changer. Oh, that's a great comment. It's a game changer. Recalls don't necessarily go with food safety, and we saw that with Hallmark. Okay? And that's important. It was a game changer. And that's what you see here in this quote. Companies like Hallmark Westlawn Meat Packing face massive losses. Peanut butter is just the latest in a long line of contaminated foods that have sickened thousands. Okay? See, we're getting lumped together. I don't want to be lumped with them. If somebody messes up, I don't want to be lumped with them. So with all that being said, what's the take-home message? What do we ultimately need to tell producers about traceability? What are my perspectives here? I said 2 years ago when I spoke here is that ultimately the issue of traceability is that we need to get into new thinking. We need to break the cake of custom. Okay, right? And that's difficult. That's challenging. It's cumbersome. And that maybe all our favorite notions and what's going on and the way it used to be maybe aren't so solid anymore. Those may be ill-founded. Okay, so that's where we need to go. I think we need to recognize that this administration, this is probably not real high on their radar list despite the listening session. Secretary Vilsack outlines these top 3 priorities for agriculture: more nutritious food, increasing alternative energy opportunities for agriculture, and transition agriculture from dependence on fossil fuels. That's what he said. He asked the President, what are the top 3 priorities when he is going to be Secretary? Okay? They're not going to come and help us out a whole lot, probably, here, relative to this. It's not a real big issue. And I think we need to recognize then on the other, the legislative branch, we have 12 people out of 535 that are directly involved with agriculture, that really, really understand what it is we do and where we're going. Okay? Are they going to get engaged with us? Probably not. And especially this year with all of the other things going on. Okay? This is probably not going to be real big on their issue sheet. And I think with that being said, right, it's pretty easy to get cynical and defeatist and kind of get our dauber down a little bit about it. And the food industry is terrible, and we're not going to get any help, and what have you. Okay? And, whatever promises we might get, they don't always come in the correct form. Okay? So, all that being said, I think there's good news out there. I had the opportunity this past spring to speak at the Tennessee Beef Alliance. And these are their objectives. Okay? Ultimately, I kind of condense those down in Nevil Speer speak. Ultimately, what the Tennessee Beef Alliance is for me is it allows producers to realize, to establish, to document, to advocate, to verify the true value of their product. And if you look at what happened a year ago, this is where they are over the market. Their members cleared an additional $67.59. That sure will pay for $4 worth of identification pretty handily. And you collect all that together, that's about almost an additional $250,000 that came into the state because of some additional efforts willing to do some business networking and work together. Well, this is what you saw this week at the airport. I'm not sure how much more needs to be said, but that's where we are. And I heard a lot of passion about this yesterday. I read the article, I could hardly get through it. This is what consumers are seeing. This is what consumers believe. There has to be another story out there. Okay? And it tears at my core when I go into the airport and read how they have magazines stacked out. You don't see it once, you see it 5 or 6 times all the way across there. And what's on the picture, top of it, the picture, is a package of hamburger. Now, that's going to play in some people's minds when they go purchase product this week. So I think ultimately what we need to tell producers is that they need to begin to view themselves as a food producer partner, not just cattlemen, not just a rancher, not just a farmer, but they are producing food, right? And I think that's very different than this sort of top-down, well, we need to educate the consumer. I've heard that so many times. I have a hard enough time educating my students who come to class for 16 weeks. Most consumers don't have the time or interest to really understand what it is that we do. How many of us really want to take the time to understand all the complexities in the financial business or the car manufacturing business? Okay, we take it for granted. But we need to begin to think of ourselves as a partner in producing food with our consumers. So traceability, and whatever you want to call it there, I think there's a better word. We haven't found it yet. Maybe we need to make one up, okay? We made up Google. We can make up something. But ultimately, what I like about traceability is it's our opportunity to advocate the producer story about what we are doing right? There's lots of concern and trepidation out there about traceback and liability. We do so many things well. Let's get out there and advocate that. Traceability is the way to be out in front of consumers every single day and telling that story. And secure value along the way. If we do it better than somebody else, excellent. That's the capitalist system. I really like how Walt Staley puts all of this, and he talks about that ultimately traceability is really a way of protecting our food brand equity. We have equity out there. And whether that's whatever kind of story whether it's quality, whatever type of credence value that goes along with some food, there's equity associated with that. And we need to protect it. And every time there's a recall and or a story like that occurs in Time magazine, that gets broken down, and we have no way really to counteract that. Okay? And ultimately, all of that stuff, the compliance plays out in public. And as we've seen here, we talked about yesterday, we really don't have the means to play that game. Not as well as we should have. So if I had a message probably to take home for producers, I think we need to begin to have a little bit of a sense of urgency. And I would recommend that you pick up not Time magazine, but Inc. magazine, and this month. And there's this wonderful interview with John Cotter. Actually, probably I think you can find it online. John Cotter wrote a book called A Sense of Urgency. And he says, decay in a company or industry happens gradually, even microscopically, one day at a time. And you know what bothers me is what I heard yesterday. And I had trouble sitting still over there. What I've begun to watch is NAIS is no longer about NAIS. It's morphed into this vehicle for activism. It became all about that NAIS is somehow tied to everything that we do wrong in agriculture. It's the big corporate structure. We're poisoning the environment. We're exploiting people. We're exploiting animals. And all of that's going to come crumbling down someday. And somehow this self-righteousness and that we're all at fault. I don't appreciate that because I don't think that's right. Because I think for the most part, we do a wonderful job of delivering a safe, wholesome, abundant product, and we don't need to back up from that for 1 second. And I don't think we need to allow NAIS to be a vehicle for those that have some alternative agenda about industrialized agriculture or wherever they want to go. That troubles me. And so I agree with Ashby 100%. Part of my duties on campus is to work in leadership studies. It's time for some leadership, and it's time to step up and begin to counteract these stories. I don't think it's running to the media. I don't think it's about educating consumers. I think it's about delivering product that we document and we verify what it is that goes on and what we do exactly right. Because we do a lot of things right.